All right, our next speaker is Peter Kalo, who is presenting with an intriguing title, Don't Copy Rachel, That Is No Way to Give Science Advice. Go for it.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I wanted to begin by at least proving that I had a copy of this, because this somewhat faded version in this scan is the somewhat faded version that you can see in the scan is the one that I acquired shortly after it was published in paperback version. And you can tell that I was reading in kindergarten. The kind of corpse-filled cover, I think, sets the tone, as indeed do some of the evocative titles of the chapters, like Elixir of Death, Rivers of Death, No Birds Sing, and Beyond the Dream of the Borgias, calling for action against the widespread use of chemicals in agriculture, which is basically the theme of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, is what I would describe as advocacy by a scientist. And let me right up front tell you that my point is not that she necessarily got it wrong. I don't think she got it all quite right, and I shall give some examples later, but certainly not all wrong. My point is that carrying out advocacy of this kind carries risks of having the science misunderstood and misrepresented, and that, I think, is problematic in a post-factual world that we find ourselves in. For me, science advice ought to be about informing, not forming or forcing policy. And looking at that kind of tension between advocacy and advice is what I want to do in this short paper. Before I get back to why I think Silent Spring actually takes us in the wrong direction in terms of science advice, let me just remind you of why science itself has been such a powerful instrument for understanding the world and translating that understanding into applications that make our lives better. And it's not just to do with the fact that it's based upon evidence carefully collected under controlled conditions. But, and this is important, it recognizes that the process recognizes that we, the practitioners, and Tim made this point as well, and I'm sure this will be a recurrent theme, we, the practitioners, exercise judgments at almost every stage of the process, from observation through to interpretation. And those observations can be biased by exactly the same kinds of heuristics that everybody that afflict everybody. Confirmation bias, mentioned by Tim, is just one of them. There can be others. So it's key then that as part of the science process, there is a requirement to take that into account. And the very first scientific society, Royal Society of London, the badges at the bottom, had as its motto, nullius in verba, which means take nobody's word for it. And this means that the evidence that we collect as part of the science has to be to the satisfaction of the community of scientists. It has to be, at least in principle, repeatable, and publication and peer review become key. We don't always get that right, but in general, science has, and that's why it has been such an important source of knowledge and information. So science works. We apply science in the environmental sector in terms of using the evidence that we collect to illuminate the kind of the is in terms of how people interact with ecosystems and what sorts of problems emerge in that context. the problems are generally complex problems, and so there are always going to be associated uncertainties, and that needs to be made plain. But this kind of approach contrasts, it seems to me, with taking a view about the world as we would like it to be, rather than the world as is, because, and this is the normative, because the world as we would like it to be is a world based on preferences and values. And as I've indicated, those preferences and values can be wrong. This is kind of the distinction between is and ought that traces right back into history, right back to Hume's treatise on human nature. And the very fundamental point that I want to make in this presentation is that advocacy, in the way that I've described it, mixes the is and the ought, and therefore has at least the potential of contaminating evidence with values and judgments that can be wrong for all the reasons that I've indicated. There are a couple of manifestations, I think, of this, at least two manifestations, that I want to look at now. And these manifestations actually lead to some, I think, unfortunate consequences. Again, unfortunate consequences within this post-factual world that we find ourselves. The first manifestation is that advocates need to be decisive. They need to be persuasive. They need to have an impact on their public. And that can tempt them to tempt us to be selective with the evidence in various ways. One aspect of this is underplaying uncertainty and mistaking correlation for causation. And that is, quite frankly, pervasive in Silent Spring. The other side of that coin is overplaying uncertainty as a basis for standing in the way of action. And this, I think, is allegedly what the tobacco industry did in undermining the connection between smoking and cancer. But interestingly, I think this is also the kind of thing that precautionary advocates do, that is, overplay uncertainty on a regular basis. Cherry picking and various forms of fraud are also aspects of being selective with evidence. I think all these aspects of being selective with evidence can be dealt with reasonably straightforwardly, and we've dealt with this in previous forums of this society, and that is by insisting that we're as transparent as we can be, and that our work is subject to peer review. The other manifestation, I think, of advocacy is a little bit more difficult, and that is that advocates want to decide for us. They often fail to at least acknowledge that with any complex problem situation, and environmental problems are complex problems, that evidence, the science, doesn't compel decisions, but it gives options. And if you translate that into what we do in CTAG, understanding how effects relate to exposures doesn't say anything at all about which exposures are acceptable. In order to get to that, you should properly try to relate it to the preferences of those affected. Silent Spring has more than a hint of this kind of manifestation of advocacy within it. That is advocacy that wants to decide for us, particularly in the final chapter, The Other Road, because in that chapter we get statements like the one at the bottom, which says, "The other road offers our last, our only chance." This is science mandating a particular outcome to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth. And you might recall that the other road here was biological control. And had we followed that prescription, I think the evidence now indicates that we wouldn't be able to feed the 10 billion that we have to. And I think there are CTAC scientists in the room who would tell you that they're working with agrochemicals that can be in which the risks can be managed. So there are alternative options here, and I think that was something, an important feature. Why am I so concerned about this kind of advocacy being perpetuated, particularly in this post-factual world? I think there are two reasons for it. One is because if we, as scientists, are seen to be selective with the evidence in whatever way, for whatever reason, then that tends to dignify politicians being selective with the truth. And I think that would be an unfortunate consequence of our advocacy. And the other is that if scientists do really imply that evidence compels decisions in these complex situations where we know what they do is actually define options, what I think we're really saying under those circumstances is that our decisions, our choices as scientists should be paramount. And that is a political decision, a political position. Something I think that was made very plain in The Honest Broker by Roger Pilkey more than 10 years ago now. So in kind of conclusion, the bottom line is that my view is that if we follow this course of advocacy in the way that I've described it, I think it brings us too close to the political camp for comfort. And in that context, it undermines the use of science, the raison d'etre for science as being as objective as we can possibly make it. And also, it undermines our credibility. So what do we do about it? I think we need to protect a process that delivers on the basis of evidence from judgments and values that may not. And having said that, I'm not an isolationist. I don't see science as being isolated from public policy. Quite the contrary, it needs to interact. And I think we should recognize that in that sense and in that context, that we should, in a democracy, expect stakeholder values to inform which problems should be addressed, but not how. And the solutions that come from the science should be looked at in terms of what is acceptable to those affected, taking into account public preferences. What I think we need to do is to use and develop institutions, and I'm using this in the broadest possible way, that recognize the importance of scientific evidence, that recognize the importance of scientific advice and advisors, and that we've heard this before, and do it transparently. And I think, I regret to say, that we seem to be moving away from that rather than towards it. In finale, as an advert, I'll just say that I'm going to be talking about this some more at the student luncheon later in the week, touching on some important aspects at the interface of science and public policy, science and government, science and democracy. And there I'm going to try and get the students to take a vote on whether it should be advocacy or advice. Thank you. So it's popular press, we shouldn't take it seriously. It wasn't science. Is that what you're saying? I have no idea. I don't. Yeah. Oh, okay. I think that's an interesting and important point. Nevertheless, the book was portrayed as a scientific perspective, and in that sense, should be judged as science. And I think that it's the approach which is dangerous, not necessarily the outcome.
So I'm just curious, there is a whole range of science designed to integrate judgment, values, risk, technical things, for decision analysis.
Yes.
It looks like you don't consider this as a science, the way you presented it. I'm just curious to hear that.
No, I think that there are sciences that can help the translation of the science that we do in CTAC, the natural science that we do, into policy, and that's one of them. I think there are other social sciences. Economics, I think, is important as well. I think, though, that we should realise that those sciences are social sciences and ought to be about capturing themselves public preferences rather than imposing preferences and biases. So I think that they provide us a structure, but they don't actually get to the actual important area of connecting the science with public values.
Yeah, I agree with you, but maybe instead of just trying to separate the field and fall for kind of antagonism, if you like, we should really focus communities to work together because it's inevitable to have biases in technical work and decision making in policy. So I just kind of said that would be a better message from my point of view.
Well, thank you.